From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. First, the headlines. UN says over 2.5 million people have fled Ukraine. Russia accuses United States of funding biological weapons research in Ukraine. New UN report says 50% of Syrians displaced and 90% living in poverty. Afghans continue to seek freedom outside the country. Survey says 1 in 5 U.S. election workers may quit amid threats. Florida establishes first of its kind election police. And our top story tonight. Ukrainians are running for their lives as Russian bombing continues. The UN says that the number of Ukrainian refugees is now higher than 2.5 million. Satellite images show that a 40-mile Russian convoy outside the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, has fanned out into nearby towns and areas. Meanwhile, the U.S. Senate voted 68-31 to approve a government funding bill that includes $13.6 billion in aid for Ukraine. President Joe Biden is expected to sign the measure. A team of 9 physicians led by Dr. Zahir Sahlul of Chicago has brought medical equipment worth $500,000 to Lviv, Ukraine. The supplies include ventilators, ultrasound machines, and gas masks. The Washington Post reports Dr. Sahlul is a Syrian American who has helped Syrians when Russian bombing destroyed their health services. Sahlul observed that the healthcare system is about to collapse because of the impact of the war. He said that, like in Syria, many of the doctors in Kiev are working in basements to avoid being targeted by Russian forces. U.S. President Joe Biden blamed Russian leader Vladimir Putin Thursday for last month's record inflation. Biden said an increase in gas and energy prices as markets reacted to Putin's aggressive actions were a large contributor to inflation. Annual consumer inflation in the U.S. rose 7.9% in February, the largest 12-month increase since January 1982, according to the Department of Labor. Putin says Western sanctions on Moscow hurt the U.S. and Europe. He added Russia is not to blame for the rising prices. Russia on Thursday accused the United States of funding research for the development of biological weapons in Ukraine. Russian Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov said that the purpose of the biological research is to establish a mechanism for the stealthy spread of deadly pathogens. U.S. officials pushed back, saying Moscow has a history of using chemical weapons. Pro-Kremlin propagandists have cast Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a war for the spiritual unity of Orthodox Christian Russians and Ukrainians. Yet an overlooked aspect of the war is the Muslims of diverse national and ethnic backgrounds playing a central role. Muslim clerics in Russia have backed President Vladimir Putin's offensive and rallied in support of Russia. Russian Muslims on the front lines are fighting against fellow Muslims defending Ukraine. Some Chechens previously defeated by Russia are now part of the Russian army. Ukraine is also home to Chechen exiles who have not forgiven Russia for crushing their independence movement in 1999 and 2000. Those Chechens are fighting on the side of Ukraine. Democratic Congresswoman ILHAN of Minnesota opposed legislation banning Russian oil and energy imports to the U.S. The United States House passed the bill with a 414-17 bipartisan vote late Wednesday. Every other member of Minnesota's House delegation supported the ban. The vote came after President Joe Biden took action on the issue earlier in the week. OMAR said putting the specifics into statute without a sunset clause or conditions for lifting the ban creates a dangerous scenario. 17 lawmakers, 2 Democrats, and 15 Republicans voted against the bill. An anti-colonial calendar monthly displays a prominent Muslim figure from across the globe. It hopes to combat anti-Muslim bias and focuses on the historic roles played by Muslims who fought for their people's freedom from imperialism. The calendar introduces 12 Muslim figures who sacrificed their lives fighting European colonists from the 15th to 20th century. It was launched by Strive UK, an advocacy group established by members of the Indian Muslim diasporic community. Students associated with Strive UK, primarily girls aged 10 to 22, were behind its creation. The month of January is juxtaposed with the image of Varian Kanutu Kunja Ahmed Haji. He was a prominent anti-colonial fighter against the British and established his own kingdom in the Malabar region of the South Indian state of Kerala in 1921. At the end of the war, he was caught and killed by the British. Escalating violence, a plunging economy, and a devastating humanitarian crisis have increased the hardship and suffering of Syrians after 10 years of conflict, according to a new UN report. The UN Syria Commission of Inquiry's report released Wednesday showed roughly half the pre-war population has been displaced and more than 90% of people are living in poverty. 12 million Syrians are facing food insecurity and 14.6 million need humanitarian aid, according to the report. Meanwhile, military skirmishes, bombardments, abductions, and killings away from conflict zones are increasing, it added. Commission Chief Paulo Pinheiro said that there is bombardments in the northwest, north, and northeast of the country, as well as targeted killings, unlawful detention, and torture. A special segment on the Syrian situation is coming up later tonight on our show. Keep watching Muslim News. Israel and Turkey have agreed to rebuild their relationship after years of tension. Isaac Herzog became the first Israeli president to visit Turkey in 14 years. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan hailed a new turning point in relationships with Israel. Meanwhile, Hamas condemned Erdogan's Wednesday meeting with Herzog, expressing sorrow over these visits to Arab and Islamic countries. Sattar Amiri clambered into a pickup truck with his wife and infant son in a remote Afghan frontier town, ready for a perilous drive through the desert. He, like thousands of desperate migrants, only has one goal: to reach Iran. In Zaranj, a border town in southwestern Afghanistan, people smugglers say that the flow of would-be exiles now reaches 5,000 to 6,000 a day. That's 4 times more than before the Taliban's return to power in August. The most daring try to scale the imposing wall separating the city from Iran, despite the risk of being shot by border guards. Thousands of men, women, and children pile into old four-wheel drive vehicles for a longer journey through mountains and deserts via Pakistan. Bringing more news stories from the US after this short break. Stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
Mr. Speaker, if I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban, or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
I am what hunger looks like in America. I am an 8-year-old girl who's not excited for the last day of school. Because this may be the last time I'll have lunch.
Till September.
I am a single father of 2 who works 3 part-time jobs, and that's still not enough to put food on the table. I was created by artificial intelligence from faces of the 1 in 8 Americans who struggle with hunger.
Feeding America, 200 food banks strong.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
U.S. election officials are increasingly concerned about threats and political pressure fueled by false allegations of voter fraud in the last presidential race. 1 in 5 poll workers say that they're unlikely to stay in their jobs through the 2024 election, according to a national survey. Of nearly 600 election officials surveyed, more than 75% said threats against election administrators and staff have increased in recent years. The percentage of workers saying that they're worried about political leaders interfering in future elections nearly tripled since before 2020. The poll also found more than 3/4 of local election officials say social media companies have not done enough to stop the spread of false election information. Tennessee's Muslim community shared concerns Wednesday with state lawmakers about voter registration and education, as well as other issues. About 40 adults and teenagers gathered for the Muslim Day at the state capitol to discuss the importance of civic engagement. They also spoke with lawmakers about legislation and performed the midday prayers together. It was the largest gathering organized by the American Muslim Advisory Council. At-large Metro Council member Zulfat Suara spoke to participants about the need for getting involved. In 2019, Suara became the first American Muslim to hold elected office in Nashville. She is believed to be the first Muslim woman to serve as an elected official in the state. The 2020 census undercounted Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans while overcounting whites and non-Latinos, according to U.S. Census Bureau estimates released Thursday. Latinos were left out of the 2020 census as more than 3 times the rate of the previous decennial headcount. Among Native Americans living on reservations and Black people, the undercounted rates were numerically higher but not statistically different from 2010 rates. People who identified as white and non-Latino were overcounted at almost double the rate of 2010. Asian Americans also were overcounted in 2020. It's unclear how well the 2020 tally counted Pacific Islanders, the Bureau reported. The Florida legislature on Wednesday approved the creation of a standalone election police force. A similar proposal was floated 2 months ago by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis under the guise of election integrity. DeSantis originally called for a budget of $6 million and a staff of 52 workers to establish a police force for the state's election administration, the Washington Post reported. Florida lawmakers allocated $2 million to the unit and called the Office of Election Crimes and Security, the first of its kind nationwide. No other state has an election crimes unit. The office will operate as part of the Department of State and will report directly to DeSantis. DeSantis is a longtime supporter of former President Donald Trump, who has made false claims that the 2020 presidential election was mired in fraud. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment on Syria. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Imam Malik Mujahid in Chicago. Just like you, I was moved by that Allahu Akbar lady. She stood her ground, fearful of none, for her hijab and for her education. Sisters and brothers, Indian Muslims are facing a genocide. India does not care for Muslim protesting, but it does care for the world opinion. Therefore, we must push the United Nations. The UN has a responsibility to protect. They must prevent genocide. Please sign this UN petition now. Get others to sign. It will help. Trust me, it will help. We need 1 million signatures, brothers and sisters. Please sign now.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. To discuss the Syrian crisis amid the Russian invasion of Ukraine, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. While Ukraine is on the news, 2.5 million people are already refugees. But there are other refugee crises we thought they are over, but they still continue. One such is in Syria. Half of the Syrian population, that's 22 million people, are displaced around the world and inside their own country. While they were looking for freedom, democracy, and Islam, bombs were chasing them, and some of those bombs were coming from Russia. I was about to say Soviet Union, but from Russia. What is going on here? And it is said that 90% of Syrians are dependent on food aid. Who's providing them all this aid? Syria, I thought, was in the past, but it is pretty much in the news because the United Nations now says that 90% need aid and half of them are still displaced. To discuss with us is Professor Guy Burton. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you.
Guy Burton is Adjunct Professor in International Affairs at Brussels School of Governance. So tell us, what is going on in Syria? We thought it was behind us.
Well, certainly it's not the case. I mean, the Syrian conflict has been ongoing for the last 10 years, but it's understandable that in the last few weeks, it has been overlooked somewhat by the events that are coming out of Ukraine, and especially here in the West and in Europe. But certainly, as I've said, the Syrian conflict has been ongoing. And I think what's been particularly timely is we've had a recent report that's come out from the United Nations that has made the point, has reiterated a number of the problems that that country is facing and that the people are facing there as well. And as you pointed in the start out, half the country has been displaced. We have around 6 million Syrians who are currently seeking refuge outside of Syria. We have an economic crisis. We have a food crisis, which has also been related to an ongoing drought that's started in the country, one of the worst for the last 7 decades. So there's a lot of things that are still going on in Syria, and it's one of those things that has been in the background but never really went away.
Are Russians still involved in Syria?
Yes, they are, and the Russians, as you allude to, they have been present in Syria in a direct way since 2015, when they shifted their diplomatic support for the Syrian regime into one that was direct and practical and physical. So Syrian troops, or those associated with, have been present in Syria. Sorry, Russian troops have been present in Syria since 2015. Of course, the Ukraine conflict has repercussions for those troops in Syria, as well as for the Syrians themselves. One of the things about the Ukraine conflict was that Putin rather hoped that he might be able to take over the country pretty quickly. He failed that, and as a result, one of the things that we're starting to see is the Russians having to reevaluate the location of their troops, potentially bringing troops over from Syria, or even bringing in Syrians who've been fighting on the Syrian/Russian side over to the Ukraine. So that could have repercussions as well in Syria for the Assad regime.
So could it be a change of power balance in Syria if Russians moved out?
Certainly, that's a real possibility. One of the things that Assad achieved as a result of Russian intervention was a rebalancing of the power situation, which was against him at the time. With Russian support and also with Iranian support, Assad was able to weather the storm. He now controls most of the country, although not all of it. There is still, opposition control in the north of the country, and the Kurdish region also has a certain degree of autonomy. But the point about this is that Assad has become quite confident, quite secure in his situation in Syria. Of course, the situation with the Russians and the slowdown of its offensive in the Ukraine could mean that the Russians have to make readjustments to their own position, and that could have consequences for the Syrians. Assad will not be happy to see the Russians withdraw from Syria, because that could destabilize him, particularly given the economic situation, which I alluded to, is in a pretty poor state of affairs at the moment.
Considering that the Iranian and Russians were both supporting Assad regime, is it possible that Iranians take a stronger role in Syria while Russians move out?
Well, certainly this is one of the things that's a possibility. The Iranians were a more present force in Syria prior to the Russians' decisions to become involved. They started at an earlier stage. And what we've seen in the last couple of years, now that Assad has taken over, managed to regain control of much of the country, is that Assad has been playing off the Russians and Iranians against each other with the prospects of contracts for rebuilding, for reconstruction, for aid, post-conflict. And so he's been using the presence of both the Iranians and the Russians to maximize as much as benefit as he can from that. Now, with the Russians potentially on the retreat, potentially having to reconsider their position in Syria, that could be a great opportunity for the Iranians. But at the same token, I think it's also worth keeping in mind, that there are other elements of the Middle East where Russian and Iranian interaction becomes relevant. And that includes, for example, the nuclear file. As you're probably aware, the 5 signatories of the nuclear deal are currently meeting with the Iranians and trying to get the Americans back into some kind of agreement. And of course, for the Iranians, their major supporter, their major partner on this is Russia. And of course, Russia itself, although it has been backing the Iranians, will also be looking to try and get leverage from its own position, in order to continue that agreement.
Are Americans and Turkish collaborating with the leftover resistance against the Syrian regime?
Yes, Turkey is still present in the north of the country. It is backing some of the opposition forces that are continuing to hold out against the Assad regime. The Americans have reduced their presence, their footprint substantially in the country, although not completely. Certainly, they did talk about withdrawing, but that has not become a finality. The Americans are still providing support to the Kurds and to some of the other opposition parties. So yes, they are still present. And of course, Turkey has its own relationship with Russia. The two have been on opposite sides of the conflict in Syria, but also been continuing a dialogue of sorts through the Astana process.
So, if United, since United Nations is saying 90% of Syrians are dependent on food aid, who is providing all that?
Well, there is currently assistance coming in from outside through the UN. But one of the big challenges and one of the big problems, of course, is how that aid is distributed. Obviously, the outside world would like to be able to do this independently of the regime. Unfortunately, the regime has been trying to take control of that and been unwilling to work with certain groups, and as a result, has been taking control of who gets hold of the aid and who doesn't. That has created its own problems because, of course, it means that certain groups have been privileged over other groups. And this is an ongoing problem. It's also why the idea that the war has come to an end is mistaken. There is still a conflict going on. Maybe the level of violence is not as extreme as it was a few years earlier, but there is a war still being waged. And one of the ways this is being done is through aid.
Is Russia going to turn Ukraine into another Syria?
Well, that is also a possibility. I mean, as I've said, the Russians found that their offensive against Ukraine, the attempt to try and do it as quickly as possible, has become bogged down. That means there is the possibility of a longer campaign taking place. And if the Ukrainians are backed from outside through the West, this creates the possibility of a kind of proxy war that goes on. That would have some parallels with what's been going on in Syria over the last decade, because it's been very much the case that Syria has not been an isolated case or insulated from the world. Various forces, various actors from outside the region have picked their proxies and used them, provided them with financing, provided them with arms to fight each other. The Russians, obviously, and the Turks, are the most notable. But if we look back over the last decade as well, we've seen Gulf actors have also been present in this conflict. So there is a possibility that what we might see happen in Ukraine, has insights, or at least the Syrian experience might tell us a little bit about what to expect when it comes to Ukraine further down the track.
Well, we hear that now there are more than 2.5 million Ukrainian refugees, but we don't see the type of ubiquitous tens of refugees as we see in Syria and other places. Has the United Nations become smarter in handling these refugees?
I think I'm not sure that that they've got that up to speed on the Ukraine crisis. It's still a work in progress, and I think also the problem with Syria is that it's an ongoing one as well. The conflict has been going on for 10 years. We have substantial numbers of Syrians living outside of the country, based in camps, and they've also been used as a political tool as well. If you go back to 2015 or so, when there was a significant number of Syrian refugees seeking asylum and refuge in Europe, this constituted a bit of a crisis at the time for European countries, and it also led to various agreements being made with the Turks in order for many of these Syrians to be based in Turkey, but also in the neighboring countries. I think maybe one of the reasons why we're not hearing so much about the Syrian refugees compared to the Ukrainian ones is because many of the Syrian refugees had to make their refuge in the neighboring countries. Of course, Ukraine being on the doorstep of Europe, this has meant that we've seen a lot more Ukrainian refugees coming into Europe and obviously into the European Union.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Burton, for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid. That was Dr. Guy Burton, Adjunct Professor of International Affairs at the Brussels School of Governance. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Jummah Mubarak, Assalamu alaikum, and good night.